Welcome, everybody. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Bart Preneel. I'm sure everybody in our field knows you, but I would like to introduce you to our audience. Professor Preneel is a full professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. His main research interests are cryptography, information security, and privacy. He is the head of COSIC Research Group, which stands for the Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography. This group was founded in 1979, and in the last 15 years, they actually turned the Belgian town of Leuven into a pilgrimage site for cryptographers. He has authored more than 400 scientific publications, invented 5 patents, participated to more than 50 research projects sponsored by the European Commission. He has served as project manager of the European Network of Excellence, ECRYPT, which brought together more than 250 researchers in the area of cryptology. And this project was very important for the European cryptography community. And from 2008 to 2013, he served as the president of IACR, which stands for International Association for Cryptographic Research. Actually, many young cryptographers first met him during his presidency at IACR. And during those IACR meetings, many of us were amazed how democratically the decisions were made under his presidency. In 2015, he was elected as fellow of the IACR. He received many awards. I think the most recent one was from Computable, and he received the IT Person of the Year award. And since the beginning of the pandemic, Professor Preneel focused on the privacy of the applications about COVID-19, and he is the technical lead of the development of the Belgian Corona Alert app that has been downloaded more than 3 million times. And today, Professor Preneel is going to talk about on general trends in security and privacy. Thank you again for being here today with us. We are excitedly waiting your talk. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Sihanger, for the nice introduction. And I wish I could be with you in person today. I also saw the weather in METU is much better than it is in Belgium. Here it's 11 degrees and raining. But I hope that after the pandemic, I will have an occasion to visit in the future. So I first want to congratulate the Institute with its birthday. And I think it's also fantastic to be part of this event with so many distinguished speakers. I'm very humbled to be invited to speak at your event. So today I wanted to discuss at a high level trends in security and privacy, where we see things going. It's of course very difficult to make predictions, especially of the future, but we'll still try to identify some trends and reflect on what it brings to society and also what it brings in terms of research challenges. So a first trend is the fact that the IoT is now finally happening, and it does make IT, information technology, more intrusive. So the term IoT was coined in 1999, so almost 22 years ago. So IoT has now grown up. And of course, IoT means that you connect all the objects to the internet. It means that we actually have connected cars, connected homes, connected factories, and even connected cities. So we put many computers everywhere and we connect them all to the internet. If you look at the graph on the right, it's a bit small, but it shows you that finally there is now more computers on the IoT than there are on the regular internet, the one we use with our laptops and smartphones. So for 2021, the forecast is about, in total, 24 billion devices on the internet, of which 14 billion are IoT devices and 10 billion are, I would say, human-owned or devices connected to people. So the IoT is finally happening. The growth is slower than predicted, but it's still, as you see, the numbers keep going up. And so IoT is becoming a reality. Now, of course, the IoT means that computers are disappearing into the environment. This is now finally happening. Of course, this brings privacy risks because it means we no longer see the computers, and the computers will interact with us, but we actually don't see them and we don't have a choice anymore. So in Europe, we have a very strong privacy regime, the GDPR, that actually says we can only process data when it's necessary for functioning or for maybe national interests. or maybe for health interests or public interests. But in general, if you don't fall under the general categories, you can only process data with consent. Now, the problem with these IoT devices is you don't even see them, and they're integral part of the environment. So imagine that you have a smart city, which means you put sensors and cameras everywhere. Does it then mean that if you enter the city, you actually give consent? Or do you argue that it's essential to operate a city to actually process all the data? So I think it actually forms an interesting challenge with GDPR regime that now computers are built in everywhere, and it's even hard to detect when our privacy violated because we don't see the computers anymore. Of course, the threat landscape is changing. Cybersecurity is becoming more and more important. While I guess when I started in this field of cryptology and security in the 80s, most of the hacking was done by, I would say, amateurs, so people who were bored and wanted to improve their computing skills or show off how good they were. As soon as we got business online in the 90s, people started buying and selling things and businesses started interacting. We got organized crime trying to find out how to make money online. And more recently, we also saw hacktivists trying to get attention for their specific goals through online hacking. What has received more attention, I would say, in the last 10 years is the fact that also now nation states and state-sponsored actors are actually hacking devices. We'll come back to this. So it means that the stakes are much higher, the opponents are much more sophisticated, and it's really affecting society to a much larger extent than it did 10 or 20 years ago. So you just have to look at the press to know that the IoT will bring security risks. If we put computers everywhere, it also means that we have vulnerabilities everywhere, and so these can be exploited. So back in 2007, US Vice President Cheney got a pacemaker implanted, and he actually learned that these pacemakers at that time already had wireless interfaces to read out parameters and to update parameters. And he was very concerned about the fact that maybe terrorists would reprogram his pacemaker and kill him this way with a perfect crime. So he insisted that the wireless interface was disabled. So in the last years, we've also been doing quite some research in our lab on medical devices in collaboration with the university hospital. And so we get devices that are explanted from people who passed away. I mean, in the beginning, the question was, will we be able to hack the device? But after a while, it was clear that we can hack every device. And the question is not, will we be able to hack the device, but actually, does it take a few weeks or a few days or a few hours, which is where we are today. So I actually gave a talk to some cardiologists, and I say, well, if I ever get a pacemaker, I want the wireless interface disabled, like Dick Cheney, because I think it's really too risky that people will in the future start hacking this device. And the answer of cardiologist was, well, we understand your concern, but you should be aware that about 2% of the pacemakers stop working at some time because they have defects. And so if there is no wireless interface, we cannot actually diagnose this. So it's kind of a very tough choice you have to make. Expose yourself to a defective pacemaker and have health problem at this reason, or expose yourself to a hack. So we hope that the security of these devices will improve. Other example that, again, these examples are old, but we do have more recent ones as well. But in 2015, this is the first electricity grid of Ukraine was being hacked. It was also brought down 1 year later, presumably by Russian hackers. So this is the first example of critical infrastructure of a country being hacked by another nation state, using actually, in this case, IT devices to go after OT devices, operational technology. Also, 6 years ago, there was research on car security. It started a bit earlier, but people started taking apart modern cars and finding out that actually it's possible to take control. And a high-profile case was this journalist who didn't quite believe the researchers, and to demonstrate this, they actually took full control of his car and sent the car with him into a ditch. And then in 2016, we had the Mirai botnet. That's kind of the opposite story. So the previous examples are IoT-style devices that are being hacked. Here, and actually as a target, here you see the opposite in the Mirai botnet. The IoT devices are being hacked, but then to use as an instrument to create a botnet to bring down other servers, to bring down actually part of the internet service in the US. So even if your devices are not secure, it doesn't affect only you, it affects the overall ecosystem. So we should all care about security of IoT devices. So our experiences have not been improved. For the Belgian Consumer Organization, our lab received in beginning of the summer a number of devices, and we were told we could spend only a few hours to look at each of them. There were smart TVs, door locks, and so on, and we managed to hack all of them even within a few hours. So the situation has not improved in the last years. That's the bad news. So why is this the case? Is it because we don't know how to secure things? I think there is a lot of research being done how to build secure systems, and METU is working on this, also COSIC, with many other labs and companies. But I think if you, in the market of IoT devices, in fact, it's unclear whether you're actually responsible. If you sell somebody a car, it has to be secure, and the brakes have to be tested, and the lights have to be properly functioning, have to be well adjusted. But for IoT devices, actually, it's not clear who is responsible. Is it the hardware producer? Is it the software producer or the firmware producer? Or is it the one who makes the whole device and sets it in the box? So it's quite unclear. There is also something called the market for lemons. So a lemon is not a fruit, but a lemon is a US term for a second car. And this is a very special type of second-hand car. It's a car that looks very shiny. And what happens if you buy it, typically for not too high price, you drive it off the parking lot, and after the first turn, the fender falls off. And if you take it a few days later on the freeway for a spin, then actually what happens is the engine burns down because the car was in an accident or a serious defect. The problem is that you can't see this. And so such a car in the US is called a lemon. And the problem is that a non-expert user can't tell a good second-hand car, which has been taken care of, and the one which actually was in an accident or was actually very badly maintained. And so as a user, you can't tell whether you got a good car or a lemon. And as a consequence, you're not willing to pay a very high price for a used car. You only want to pay a couple of $1,000s because you may as well be back in a few days or weeks to buy another one. And so this is known as a market for lemons. So if you can't judge as consumer the quality, you're actually not willing to pay the price. And so we have the same phenomenon in IoT security, or in general in security of IT systems. It requires a lot of effort by experts to tell secure devices from insecure devices, and the average user cannot tell the difference. So as a consequence, the user is not willing to pay for security. And as a consequence of that, the vendor is not willing to invest in security. And so you end up with a failed market because you get no better security because the vendors don't invest and the consumers actually don't have a good option. The other problem is also been identified as an economic reason for IoT security failures is tragedy of the commons. So in general, people don't want to invest for the problem of somebody else. So the commons in an English village is a central area where people could put their sheep or their cows to eat some grass. And this was a common area for everybody. Of course, what people sometimes did was they put all their sheep on there, they ate all the grass, and then they disappeared. So some person took advantage of the whole thing, had free food for the animals, and then the rest are left behind with a mud field. And so we have something similar in security. In general, people are not willing to invest to make a more secure ecosystem. And this holds for providers of software and hardware, but also for ISP providers. So in general, we're all in there for the benefits, but we don't want to invest in security because it doesn't affect us directly. So very often, if you make a system more secure, it's not you who benefit directly, it's actually other players, and so you get a misalignment of security investments. So how you can solve this, of course, is with regulation, but this is very complex because a lot of the industry doesn't want to see regulation. With certification, but again, certification is a very complex problem because it means that you have to find a cost-effective way to separate secure from insecure products. And this is very hard. We have to work more on this because at this moment, what industry is using certification is common criteria, and it's very expensive, slow, and ineffective. So this is, I think, an interesting research challenge. I still think that in 20 years from now, we will look back at 2021 in the same way as we look today at this Chevrolet Corvair from 1961. So it's a car that's now 60 years old. It looks very beautiful, very stylishly designed, beautiful color, also nice color of the house. So it looks like a very attractive car, but then you go look inside, you will find out that there is no seat belts, there is no ESP, there is no ABS, there is no safety features. And actually, if you end up in an accident, what will happen is that the metal pin of the steering wheel will actually pierce the driver into his seat forever. So I think this is a bit how our systems will look in 20 years. So today we look at these cars and we wonder, like, how could people build such cars? They look very shiny, but they're actually highly insecure. And I think in 20 years, people will look at our systems today and say, how could we do this? How could we build such laptops and webcams? And how could we put on the market such cars with so bad security features? How could we do this ever? So this is call for action. And it's not only technology, it's also finding a legal component, but also for researchers, the question is, how can we, for a low, reasonable cost, certify security so we can convince consumers which devices are secure or not secure? The second trend, again, a trend is old already, a decade, which is big data, which we can collect ever more data. But unfortunately, we see that we also have ever bigger breaches. And as humanity, we're very optimistic. We always think that things will go fine, but of course, we always have big incidents. We have burning oil platforms. We have Fukushima for nuclear power. We had 2008, the financial system breaking down. So as humans, we build these huge systems, and then we kind of surprised that actually these systems can collapse and can fail in ways we didn't anticipate. So today, for convenience and performance, we actually store our data in the cloud. This is highly convenient because it means that if your smartphone dies, you just buy a new smartphone and you have all your data again, all your pictures, all your contacts, all your information is there. Also for companies, of course, outsourcing infrastructure is much more flexible and much more cost effective than managing everything yourself. But I guess we should be reminded of the statement that the cloud is someone else's computer. So in some sense, you're no longer in charge. If your data is in the cloud, your cloud is actually a computer operated by somebody else. And if your data is there, you're no longer in full control. The second principle we have in our IT world is that market share is more important than security. And also we try to offer free services where users pay with their data. So if you actually do a search instruction, or you store your data in a cloud as a consumer, or use a social network, you don't pay the provider of this service, you actually pay with your data. And so this has been phrased as by Andrew Lewis as follows: if you're not paying for something, you're not a customer, you're the product being sold. Now, when we think of this, we very often think of the large players, the Google, Facebook, and Microsoft players, who make indeed tens of billions of dollars with advertising income. But what many of us are not aware is that, in fact, there is a much more complex ecosystem in addition to all those large companies. On the left side, you have the marketing, the people who want to show advertisement. On the right side, you have the publishers. This is people who produce content like newspapers or other websites with content. And so there is a whole complex ecosystem of hundreds of companies that analyze our data and try to optimize delivery of ads to consumers. And these companies are appearing and disappearing all the time. They've been merged and so on. So, but all these companies are processing our personal data. And so, of course, in the EU with GDPR, you have the right to know who has your data, for which purpose, and so on. But in practice, it's almost impossible to even find out which these companies are and what they're exactly doing. But this is more or less what we've created, a kind of monster. We've created a complex system that is necessary to make sure that we can get all these free services. But free means we actually pay with our data. And some people have said, well, data is the new oil. It's actually our data that makes the economy turn. This trend in big data goes even further in medical data. If you look at DNA, what you see here is the cost to sequence human DNA. So you may remember that this was a very big milestone. It was first achieved 20 years ago, and the cost was several tens of millions of dollars. And so as you see, these costs have dropped dramatically. So in the white, you see Moore's law, which would mean a cost reduction by a factor 2 every 18 months. But you see in practice, actually, sequencing the human DNA now costs less than $1,000. So there is an enormous reduction in cost, way faster than Moore's law, which of course will revolutionize science in the future, because we will be able to have better healthcare and better understand our bodies. There is, of course, risk associated with this. There is quite some websites already and companies that do DNA tests and that promise to assert your risk for certain diseases that can be in your DNA. It can also be used to determine your ancestry. And of course, it has already been discovered that police use these now to find out or solve cold crime cases. But I think a very big risk is also what about insurance companies? Because if they would have actually this data, they could, of course, abuse it to deny insurance to some people. And DNA makes a very good point, because you can, of course, argue as a citizen, well, it's my decision whether or not I share my data with one of those companies and whether I want to know certain things about my DNA. But of course, the problem is that if you put your data there, it also reveals information about your relatives. And this is how crimes are solved. Of course, people who are serial killers don't tend to upload their DNA to these servers, but some of their relatives tend to do this, and this is how they get caught. So there is benefits for society, but the point I want to make is that actually uploading your data there presents not only a risk for you, but presents a risk also for other people. And there is benefits, but there is also serious risks we have to think about. So one of the risks is that this data will be lost. So it seems that we've now decided that the most convenient way to process data is to store it with live servers in the cloud and have all our analysis done there. This is how businesses operate. This is how we as consumers work with our data. What we tend to forget is that many of these services tend to get breached. And I recommend that you look at this website. It's called Information is Beautiful. There is many nice visualizations, and one of them shows all the data breaches. And I only showed you the last couple of years. It actually goes further. And you see here bubbles. And the bigger the bubble, the bigger the data set being lost. So the record, I think, is the Indian data set from India, from the voters or the citizens is 1.1 billion. But you see also several breaches of Facebook of 400 million, 500 million, and so on. So more or less, your data has already been breached several times. If you're a user of some of these services, some of the hotels, sometimes it's the government, it can also be healthcare providers. We actually seem to be losing billions and billions of data items all the time. And of course, this can be used for intelligence purposes, but also for crime purposes, and to violate people's privacy. In particular, I think the presence of medical data and government data is very concerning. It's not only a privacy problem, because the Office of Personnel Management of the US also lost this data, and the OPM, as it's called, it contains the data of everybody who has a security clearance in the US. It's several million people, and it contains, of course, their name and their address, a social security number, the languages they speak, what they studied, but of course also their relation problems, their health problems, maybe their drug or alcohol problems. So highly sensitive data exactly of the people who are in charge of security of a country. So it shows that these breaches are not only problematic in terms of privacy of people and security of a citizen, in the sense that you want to trust your government or trust these organizations, but they actually can have also major implications on the security of a country or society at large. So I think that in 20 years from now, again, we will think of big data today and the big data hype a bit as we look at pollution today. So when I grew up, the rivers in my country were completely polluted because of the industrial boom after World War II. And there was quite some smog. There was even more smog, for example, in London than in Belgium, but there was quite some smog. At this moment, the smog is clearing. We still have a little bit of, we still have particles pollution, which is much harder to see. But at least we're making progress cleaning up our rivers, and we're thinking now, what were we thinking in the 50s and 60s to dump all our chemicals and to have very polluting cars and to actually ruin our environment? I think something similar we are doing now with big data. I think this is how we should look at this. We're polluting the environment with all our data. And we, of course, attracted by all the value, but we forget that this data will be breached and can be abused. I gave already one example. Another example is an application that was run about 10 years ago by researchers on Facebook. And this application computed based on your data available in Facebook to which percentage somebody was gay. So this was decided based on your friends, based on the bars or restaurants you liked, based on the books you read, based on the movies you liked, and so on. So for everybody, a percentage was identified. And of course, it's highly unethical research because some people are gay but don't want to out themselves. And so this tool actually outed people against their will, because it actually was possible for everybody to determine this number. And unfortunately, this number was quite accurate. So again, this makes the same point that you can say, well, I'm not gay. I have nothing to hide. Well, by sharing your data in the social network, it actually is possible for other parties to separate or identify minorities and to actually harm them. And so again, privacy should not be seen as an individual decision. What do I share or what do I not share? It's actually a collective decision. If we all pollute the world with our data, actually we create harm for the weakest in society. And so I can, that's another way of thinking of this. We should try to get rid of this, and I'll come back for solutions later. A third thing is that actually we now use AI a lot also for security. AI is another of the buzzwords together with IoT and big data. And so if you go to security conferences and you listen to vendors, again, for the last 5 to 10 years, they say we have to use big data and AI for security. So how does that work? Well, they say, well, we now have these billions of devices, which means every company may have been managing hundreds, thousands or millions of devices. So at least you have to have full control and visibility. You have to have a SOC, Secure Operations Center. You have to look at all your devices so you know who's talking to whom, what's being sent. You have to have a complete monitoring of all your system. Because if you can't see everything all the time, how can you keep it secure? That's the first step. Then, of course, comes the argument that, well, securing a device is really expensive, as we saw before. There is no real market for this. It's too hard to do. So rather than trying to build secure devices and making secure networks, let's just keep things insecure as they are, but watch everybody all the time. It's a bit the same argument that you would say if you want to secure a university campus, you could put, of course, a high wall around it. And the case with entrance, check the control with entrance and badges for students and staff to get in. You could, of course, also put cameras everywhere and to monitor everywhere in every corridor, every building, every parking lot, put cameras and watch everybody all the time. And so you just will identify those people who behave suspiciously. So that's the idea. Rather than making secure devices and secure networks, you just monitor everything. So you focus on monitoring rather than on putting in defense. But then, of course, if you do this for a campus, you already will have thousands of cameras, so you cannot hire hundreds of security guards to watch these cameras. So you then want to use AI, artificial intelligence, to actually learn what is good behavior and bad behavior and actually try to keep the bad guys out by automatically identifying them. Sounds very interesting. It's not clear this is going to work, but this is the approach industry is taking today. It's, of course, highly privacy violating. And the smartest bad guys, of course, will make sure that they adapt their behavior, and they will also use AI to make sure that they behave in a way that the other AI can't detect. And then the other AI will improve again. And so what we will see in the next decade is the war of the AIs. So you have AI systems trying to attack and defend each other. And we as users, we will just be there, and all our data will be monitored all the time in the IT system, because that's what needed to make the whole system secure. It's a bit dystopian. So in general, what we get, and of course, what I haven't focused on so far is that we will get more and more devices in our body as well. This is, again, something we can foresee in the next 10 years. So we first had a mainframe in the building, then we got in the 80s desktop, in the 90s we got a laptop, in the zeros we got a smartphone in our pocket, and now we get smartwatches. And of course, the next step will be to have implantable devices, which will be there to monitor our wellness and our health. But of course, it also means that we are more and more monitored. On the other hand, also, technology gets better and better, cameras, AI, and so on. So more or less, you see that an increasing number of governments is putting cameras everywhere, together with intelligence to monitor behavior of people, and there is no way to escape anymore. And this is a new model of security. It was first applied to networks, and the next paradigm will be applied to people. Now, AI is great, of course, and I mean, I point here to the privacy risks. Also, AI by itself is a technology that has privacy and security risks. Like the security risks are obvious. If you could hack the AI, you could actually make the wrong decisions, and the bad guys could be left unidentified. There is also quite some privacy concerns, apart from the ones I mentioned, which is that these systems could be used in the wrong way. So, for example, it has been noted that if you have a large AI model, that actually, if you analyze this, you can identify individual training data in this model. Of course, models themselves could be stolen, and that could be the property. There has also been quite some research in the last decade on algorithmic fairness. So if you want to read about this, I recommend you the book, Weapons of Math Destruction. It actually discusses this problem, that if you have a lot of data, and then you train it with AI, you don't always end up with a system that actually is fair, because there is bias in your data. and your system may end up with very strange decisions. So examples are of this bias are some courts in the US that used actually AI to determine sentences. And it turns out, of course, that these courts sentenced Black people to much higher sentences for the same crime than white people. And this is, of course, based on the algorithm, but it's not because an algorithm computes something, actually, that it is fair. A more extreme example is this algorithm implemented by Google that managed to recognize objects. This is something we achieved with deep learning in the last decade. So 20 years ago, it was not feasible to have an algorithm identify objects. But then when this algorithm was applied to people, it turned out that actually Black people were identified as apes or as gorillas. And it's actually quite shocking to show you that AI can make mistakes because of bias in the data or because of biased training data, and bias in the way the algorithm converges. A bit more recently, but still 7 years ago, people discovered that actually it's very easy to fool AI algorithms. So we have now a very powerful deep learning, but what you see here on the left is a number of pictures of a school bus on top left and of a dog bottom right, and some other pictures in between. It turns out that for each of those pictures, you can carefully craft some noise, and as a consequence, all of what you get is the right picture. So in the middle, you see a bit of noise, and on the right, you see a slightly modified picture that to our eyes as humans still looks like a bus and like a dog. But if you give it to the AI algorithm, to the neural network, it will say that they're all an ostrich. So they will all be recognized as an ostrich, whether it's a dog or a minivan. So it's possible to distort the image in a very specific way such that actually the outcome can be any other category. In this case, an ostrich was chosen. This sounds like, well, interesting. There is some problem there, but in fact, it's quite dramatic because we want to move towards autonomous driving. And a very important element there is that, of course, these cars can recognize objects like pedestrians and bicycles, but also traffic signs. And several modern cars today already have automated recognition of traffic signs, and they will show those traffic signs to a human driver. Human driver can still correct, but if you show it to a computer, to a robot, it will actually act based on this. And what you see here is an example of really shocking. You see, of course, something that we all recognize as a stop sign, but the AI researchers put a small sticker on it. And as a consequence, the stop sign is recognized with very high probability, about 95%, as a speed limit. So in fact, the autonomous car will see this sign and will drive through this stop sign at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour because it really believes that this stop sign is a sign that says 50 kilometers per hour allowed here. So there is still quite some research going on to try to solve this, but it's a very challenging problem because we don't fully understand how deep learning algorithms work and fail. I mean, they have been so far an amazing success because we had large data sets available and a lot of computational power available. But so the adversarial problems show that we don't fully understand how to make them work and how to make them robust. So we should not rely too much on AI for our security and privacy, and we should also understand the shortcomings of this. The fourth trend looks a bit more towards the future. So unless you've been living on a different planet, you definitely have heard of quantum computers. Again, some concept that's 40 years old, coined by Yuri Maman in Russia and Richard Feynman in the US. And so they were trying to simulate physical processes. And these processes in physics are very complex because we have quantum physics. And so it turns out that it's highly computationally intensive to make predictions about physical objects in physics, quantum objects with a classical computer because they behave in a very strange way. And so they had the idea of building a computer based on the principles of quantum physics to actually mostly model quantum physics processes. This would be really nice for the people in physics to make predictions. And for example, that could lead to better molecules, better medicine, because medicine depends on predicting how molecules will behave. And so a quantum computer would be extremely suitable at this. And so people started to build these things. First, in the 90s, 1-bit computers. What you see here is a picture which is 20 years old, a computer built in Stanford. At that time, it was the largest quantum computer. It was a 7-bit computer built in 2001. This computer was actually not used to model some physical processes, but it was used to factor and it actually was managing to factor 15 in 5 times 3, which doesn't seem to us like a major achievement, but of course at the time it was a real breakthrough because it was the first 7-bit quantum computer that actually could do some calculations. So this was based on the work of Shor. So Peter Shor in '94 showed that actually quantum computers would also be extremely suitable to break public key cryptography. And in particular, what we're using today, which is RSA based on factoring, and then Diffie-Hellman and discrete log variance based on discrete log in ZP and discrete log over elliptic curves. So it turns out actually that using a very clever FFT technique, a quantum computer can factor or compute discrete logs in almost linear space and very small time. And a bit later, Love Grover also showed that actually a quantum computer could search a symmetric key in the square root of the time of a classical computer. So you have halving the number of bits of security. So if you had a classical algorithm with 128-bit security against a classical computer, against a quantum computer, the security would be reduced to 64 bits. So in symmetric key, we can solve this quite easily. We just double the key length. It turns also out that the constant is very big, so it's not even clear there is any short-term implication in the next 20 or 30 years. But if we want to defend against Grover's attack, we just double the key length and we're done. For public key, this is a very different story. We have to find completely new algorithms. And indeed, we have to start worrying because the big players are getting investing in this. So Google bought a UCSB physics department building quantum computer, and they actually have a 70-bit computer. IBM has a 50-bit computer. And Rigetti has a 128-bit computer. It's not a full quantum computer, but it's still a very powerful device. Now, how far are we from factoring RSA 2048 or maybe RSA 1024? Well, to factor RSA 1024, which is a little bit beyond state of the art. I mean, we now use 2048, for example, in most systems. But to factor a 1024-bit number, so 330 digits, you would require 2048 ideal qubits. Now, the problem is that current quantum computers don't have ideal qubits, they have very noisy qubits. And so this means that, in fact, you would need many, many qubits, physical qubits, to actually simulate an ideal qubit. And so the current estimate is that we would need something like 1.5 million real qubits to be able to have 2048 ideal qubits, and then to be able to factor RSA 1024. So 72 or 128 is still very far from 1.5 million, so it's not going to happen next year or in 5 years, but maybe in 10 or maybe in 20 years it will be possible to do this. So today we actually have massive use of public key cryptography, for example, to secure the web, TLS, secure Signal, to secure WhatsApp, to secure all our software updates. So you should actually start thinking about getting rid of our current public key cryptography, replacing it by new algorithms. But so the question is, when should we do this? And for this, we were going to use some mathematics. It's Friday evening, so I'll be short with the mathematics. And a very simple linear equation. So you first have to make a guess how long it will take until the first large quantum computer will be built. So maybe we think it's going to take a while, and we say it's 2040. So we think it still will be 19 years away. Then we can look at how long it will take to switch to new algorithms. And of course, we first have to finalize the algorithm. Then we have to produce a standard. Then we have to implement the standard. And then we have to deploy the standard. And so it depends a bit on the field where you look. In some areas of the internet, we can deploy things in a few years. But if you look at embedded devices, it can take up to 10 to 12 years before you can upgrade something. Because, for example, upgrading the algorithms used in a car, this is problematic because cars in general are not designed to upgrade their crypto algorithms. They're stuck in there, and it's expected that they will last a lifetime of a car, say 20 years. And then the third question is, how long do you want your data to be confidential? Because you're encrypting data, and this, you can assume that your data will be stored. We know that some governments, like the US government, massively collect data, and if they can't read it because it's encrypted, they actually store it in a large data center in the hope that they will be able to encrypt it, decrypt it in the future. So in Utah, there is such a data center for the NSA where all encrypted communication are being stored, just in case they can break it in the future. So now we come to Mosca's equation. So given Q, X, and Y, I have to start switching to quantum-resistant cryptography in the year 2021 plus Q, so as many years it takes to get a computer, minus X, as many years to complete the switch, and minus Y, the number of years my data has to be confidential. So I have the example already below. If I plug in Q20, X10, and Y10, it means I should actually start switching today, which is problematic because there is no ready-made standards available today. So we actually have to start worrying and hurry up a bit. There have been some efforts. This is a more technical slide. I will not say too much, but so the US government has run an open competition to which they got 82 submissions in two categories, encryption and signing, so for privacy and for authentication of data. As you can see, the biggest category was lapises, and there is now 5 schemes left after 3 rounds in the finals. There is 1 code-based scheme left. There is actually 1 multivariate scheme as left, but it has been shown to be weak at last Eurocrypt, this week actually. There is no hash-based scheme left, but we must say that there is a fallback scheme, and there is already an IETF standard, so there is a hash-based signature, and all the other schemes were broken. So more or less, it was a ruthless competition running over a couple of years, and the outcome is that actually we only are left with some lattice-based schemes and some 1 code-based scheme and a hash-based signature. So from the 82 schemes, very few have remained, but we do believe we have some solid candidates. So that's the good news. The bad news is we now have to finalize this and get this rolled out in the next 5 to 10 years, which is a major challenge for cryptography because we have to redesign many things because these algorithms are quite different from what we have today. The last trend I already hinted at is that we get a new adversarial model in security and privacy. So nation states are actually now involved. It's no longer hackers or organized crime. It's now nation states. And in the largest nations, they have thousands and thousands of people who are trying to hack systems. So when Snowden released his documents 2013, he said the slogan of the NSA is collect it all, which was not so surprising because we knew that the NSA was massively intercepting data. This was obvious from other documents, but they also apply AI to learn, so and analyze it, know it all, and exploit it all. And this last aspect was new. I don't think we were aware before the Snowden leaks that the NSA was doing so much hacking. So exploiting not means exploiting information, it means exploiting systems, hacking systems to get access to more information. So another important lesson we learned from Snowden is that actually you have in society, you have users, industry, and government, and depending on where you live, you may trust industry or government more. So, but there is a balance of power between those 3 players. So in Europe, for example, I think people tend to trust their government more, but distrust industry a bit. In the US, it's the other way around. So what you then have is a privacy regime that actually controls industry, and maybe you also have a constitution that limits government. And so you try to use laws to control what industry and government can do, because in this relationship, the user, of course, the citizen is the weak party. Now, industry is changing a lot. We have big data, we have Internet of Things, we have the advertising ecosystem. This has been described by Shoshana Zuboff as surveillance capitalism. So we're actually being exploited in some sense. This is how industry now makes money based on our data. What we know from Snowden is that there is the PRISM program. So the PRISM program means that the government has access to the data in the cloud, to the big data, to the IoT data. The government has access to all this data. And to some extent, the government loses interest in limiting access of industry to data or limiting collection of data by industry. Because the more data industry collects, the more data the government also has. I think this is really a disadvantage for the citizens. It means that the power balance is shifting. And in a very short time, in less than 30 years, I think we had some reasonable privacy and reasonable balance. And now I think it's very hard to actually protect your essential data as a citizen against both industry and government. That's what we have achieved with technology evolution. We have many benefits, but also we have achieved this problem. So, of course, large governments like the US, UK, China, Russia, they can afford to hire large armies of hackers. If you can't do this, you can also hire companies like Hacking Team. And Hacking Team was an Italian company, or is an Italian company. And their slogan is, we believe that fighting crime should be easy. So they actually hack on behalf of government. And they sell these tools to police forces and to intelligence services. Now, we know about Hacking Team because Hacking Team was hacked. And if you go to Wikipedia, you can find the explanation. So 47 gigabytes of data was hacked, including all their tools and all their customer lists. So I invite you to go and look there who is among their customers. This was an incident a few years ago. This year in the news was NSO Group, an Israeli company, but actually managed to get control with a silent attack, so zero-click attack on a phone, and be able to read all the messages, listen to the conversations, use the video, and so on. So actually get a silent, complete control over the phone. And again, NSO Group is selling its data to many governments, of which not everybody is equally democratic. So this is how governments who don't have their own hacking team or their own hackers, they can actually buy these products and use them. Of course, people have been warning in the last decades for the militarization of cyberspace. So cyber is becoming the next dimension after the land, the sea, the air, space. So the fifth dimension for war is cyberspace. It must be mostly focusing there on collection of intelligence, so collecting data. But we're evolving, of course, towards hacking, because if you hack, you actually get full control. I mean, there is one thing to eavesdrop phone communications. You can find out a lot of data, but most of us use now more and more encryption. So if you can hack the phone, you actually get access to all the data. Plus, you can watch the camera, you can listen to the microphone, and so on. So this has been the business of intelligence agencies, but also private contractors, like I gave the examples, but also non-state actors. So some governments want deniability, and they have kind of fuzzy organizations that do the hacking on behalf of them. And if they're caught, the government claims that they have no association with them. So you end up in a very legal fuzzy area where there is kind of deniability. And it doesn't stop at just collecting data and intelligence. It actually goes further, and it means taking control and damaging systems. So a few years ago, the US government actually showed this graph, and they said, this is how many new 0 days, so these are new flaws in the system we have released to the public. So we actually have helped companies, because when we found serious flaws, we have informed the companies, and 96% of the 0 days we found, we have informed the companies of those 0 days. So what they did not say is what they did with the 4% that they did not tell about. So apparently 4% of the 0 days they don't tell you, they actually hack your system. They also didn't say after how many months or years they told you. So maybe the governments have been hacking systems for months or years, and only after a very long time they tell the companies there is a flaw in your system, please fix it. So but in general, if you find a 0 day, so a serious flaw, say in iPhone or in Android, you can tell Apple or Google, and you may get $100,000, especially if it's a serious flaw. But if you really want to make money, you sell this flaw on the black market to either governments or shady organizations, and you can make 10 or 20 times the same amount. So what our governments are doing is, rather than helping us to secure the infrastructure, they're actually collecting weaknesses of systems. They're not really timely informing the vendors, but they're using it to hacking. And this can go badly wrong. A good example is the SMB external blue. Sorry, eternal blue is a typo vulnerability. It's a Microsoft vulnerability, which was found by the NSA Equation Group, a group at NSA called Equation Group. It was stolen from them by probably a Russian group called Shadow Brokers, and it ended up to be in WannaCry and NotPetya. So this is the big wave of ransomware attack a couple of years ago to be launched against Ukraine, NotPetya. But so NotPetya was so powerful as ransomware and as malware that actually it escaped Ukraine. The shipping company Maersk lost between $250 and $300 million because of this attack. And the FBI estimates the total damage of NotPetya around $10 billion. So very interesting. So the US government knows about the flaw in Microsoft systems. Rather than telling Microsoft they keep it for them, then they lose it to Russian hackers. The Russian hackers use it to attack Ukraine, and then it escapes from Ukraine. It actually shuts down hospitals in the UK, shipping companies all over the world, and so on. So this is more or less where we are today. It's a very worrisome development. So I don't think we can stop this, but I think as citizens, we should actually have more control. I think if you have so much power, and I think it's going to be almost impossible to take this power ever away, because governments can now take control of the electricity grid of other countries. They can take control of the hospitals. They can take control of the radar systems. So this is now more or less a bit like with nuclear warfare. So you have kind of mutually assured destruction. But I think it's very important that if you have elements of your government with so much power, you actually supervise them very strictly. Because decisions of not releasing or not informing a vendor about the 0-day can have major implications and can actually create major damage. And so I'm afraid that things will first get worse before they get better. There have been some initiatives where Microsoft, for example, asked to have a kind of Geneva Convention for cyberspace. The Geneva Convention says that you should not attack civilians in time of war. But the point Microsoft made is that in the cyber world, nation states and loose groups are attacking civilians in time of peace. Because in fact, the internet, this is our phones, our laptops, our cars, our homes, and our electricity systems. Okay, so maybe this was kind of a bit pessimistic. So I think there are actually things we can do. And I think we should probably go the area of decentralization. I'm not the first one to say this. I think the cryptocurrencies are an example, and maybe not the best example, but at least they show that it's possible to build more robust decentralized systems. So I think in general, the way the internet is built, the centralization there, the fact that we put everything in the same clouds is actually a risk. And we should probably rethink the architecture and make a more robust and decentralized architecture where we store data of citizens with citizens, and maybe make backup with our friends or family members, so that if our server dies, we still have the data, but don't do it in a central place where intelligence services have access, and where if something goes wrong, everybody will lose everything. So rethinking architectures. As a cryptographer, of course, I have to tell you that cryptography can also play its role. It's not a miracle solution, but it can help. So cryptography is very good at protecting data communicated, like all our conversations, and stored data, like what's on our phones or on our hard disk. But the next challenge for cryptography is to store and protect data during computation. So you have your data in the cloud, but the idea is, can we actually protect data, compute on it, make sure that the computations are correct, so we don't compute things you should not compute. So there is some orbit what's being computed, but you compute on the data while they remain encrypted. And the only thing that leaks is the outcome. So I think in general, you should store less data in the cloud. If you look at the modern smartphone, it has more power than a Cray from the 80s. Yet everything we do with it, we store it in the cloud. Every picture we take is stored in the cloud. Every mail we send is stored in the cloud. This device is powerful enough to keep our data. We just have to find local mechanisms, and we should try to get rid of our addiction to the cloud. We should try to find more robust distributed architectures where data stays local, because that's the only way to really control it. Second thing is a technology invented in the 80s, and which is now becoming practical, called multi-party computation. What you do there is you have multiple parties that want to compute on their data, but don't want to share their data. And so with cryptography, you can actually jointly compute some information on the data without sharing the data itself, yet you can be sure of the correctness of the computation. Or you can also use it in a different way. Rather than putting all your data in the cloud, you share your data in multiple pieces, and you put every piece in a different cloud, in such a way that an individual piece doesn't leak any information. It's just a random piece of information. Only when you combine them, you get meaningful information. And with MPC, you can share your data over multiple cloud providers and then still compute on it and get the result. Not the cloud provider is ever learning what is happening. This is now being deployed for several solutions. This is no longer science fiction. There are several startups in this space that actually allow you to use the cloud in a privacy-friendly way. The price to pay is typically a high communication overhead. The other solution has a low communication overhead but high computation overhead. There you store your data in the cloud but encrypted with a special encryption mechanism so that you can still compute on it. And this is known as fully homomorphic encryption. And this was first realized by Gentry 12 years ago. But since then, at that moment, it was completely impractical. Since then, major improvements have been made. And for example, there are companies like Zama that today can already evaluate a small neural network efficiently in encrypted domain. So this is also something which we can do. So already mentioned by Siang at the beginning. So in fact, in Europe, we rolled out a contact tracing solution developed by some researchers led by my old student, Camilla Troncoso at EPFL. So what we do there is a bit keep data local, share minimal information in the cloud, only very few and non-personal information. And based on this, we can do contact tracing. And so there is no central database with who was in contact with whom. The government cannot find out who broke the rules. It's just a local decision on the phone that allows you to tell you, yes, you have a high risk contact or a medium risk contact or no. And I think this was an amazing success. Of course, nothing was perfect. It was developed in a very short time. But we managed to actually get in half a year time about 100 million downloads in Europe, of which about 3 million in Belgium. And at European level, we managed to connect all databases in 18 countries. So actually, if you use this app, you can use a Belgian app in Belgium, you will be warned about Germans in Belgium and vice versa. If you travel to Germany, the app will also work there and inform you. But I think it shows it's possible to do contact tracing, which seems to be something very intrusive, in a highly privacy-friendly way. So it's actually possible to do this. So a final element of the puzzle, I think, is to go for open solutions. So it's clear that if you look at information technology, what has happened today is if you look at your phone or your device, well, the large players know everything about you. You're in full transparency, while actually the powerful players, the governments and the GAFAMs, Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on, they're completely opaque. You don't know what they're doing with your data. If you think about society, it should be the other way around. The weak people, the citizens, should actually have privacy. And if you're very powerful, you should be transparent. And everything you do should be visible and should be justifiable and auditable. And so one aspect of transparency is have open software and hardware, where we actually avoid this problem of backdoors, of hiding weaknesses and 0 days, or having systems with flaws which we can't actually patch. So I think it's not a miracle solution, but I think if we want to have a more secure infrastructure, we should actually have open software and open hardware. Was my final message. So to wrap up this talk, thank you for your attention. So maybe my message was a bit pessimistic. So it seems that by moving to IoT, to big data and AI, we have many benefits, but also many risks. And if we don't do something, it's a bit like global warming. If we don't do something, it's actually going to get worse and worse, and we will end up maybe with a dystopian society. Just like for global warming, we can actually do things. It's possible to re-architect systems. It's possible to make sure systems reflect values like transparency and accountability for the powerful players, while privacy for the weak players, and to actually stop polluting with spreading all our data. Of course, we can do surveillance and governments can play their role, but they should be governed and controlled carefully. We should actually have an industrial policy, which means we should control industry because the big tech players have way too much power, but also some governments have way too much power. And it's a challenge for us citizens to get this power back. And a small part of this puzzle is some of the advanced cryptography and some of the open technologies. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Preneel. It was as fantastic as usual, but it was also very informative. I know you might be tired, but I want to ask you a few questions if you have the time.
That's fine. That's okay.
So actually, what I was thinking during your talk, you know, people believe conspiracy theories very easily, and you know, they might believe a lot of things we find irrational. But all of the warnings you have made and the things you have talked, if they are, you know, more scared than most of the conspiracy theories, right? Because we know what are the main problems in the sector and so on. So do you think that we are able to raise awareness in this area? So as cryptographers or security experts, should we do more to, you know, let people know what is happening to their data and what they can be done, what they can do by themselves?
I think, yes, as scientists, we have a responsibility to try to talk to people and to also try to go out and talk to not only to technical people, but also to the broader audience. I think on the other hand, of course, we have to understand that it's not cryptographers or scientists who will change the world. I mean, if you, I don't want to make an analogy, but I think in global warming, we need to Greta Thunberg. I mean, somebody who's very visible and does this. I think in terms of, for example, regulation of big tech, it's clear now that Facebook somehow has seemed to have crossed the line, and that there is now an awareness with the general public that we should do something about this. So I think these slides are already, some of these slides are very old, but I think our criticism of Facebook and big data did before the crisis, before people started actually getting upset at big tech and the abuse of power. But I think this is now part of the story. You now I see lawyers publishing papers how to regulate big tech. So I'm not saying that this is my credit, not at all, but I do think as scientists we have a role to play. But I think the challenge is, of course, we should try to engage with the broader public, engage with journalists, and it's a story which has to be told many times. It's like a drop that you fall on a stone many times before actually you will make a small hole in it. I don't think you can convince people like this, but we have to repeat the message. And it seems that at least for some of these messages, of course, Snowden has been a very big impact because he made global impact. I think maybe what is missing in this whole message is there is an alternative. Yeah. Right? So alternative is not only regulation, there is also a technology alternative. But the problem is to give it in the market, to give it a fair chance in the market, because it's, of course, impossible to go with technology against monopolists or against too powerful players. But I think the message we can as scientists give is there is an alternative. It's not the case that these systems have to be centralized, that we need all the data somewhere, or that you can only run a search engine if you do advertisement. It's actually possible to build things differently. And as scientists, we can show this, and I think this contact tracing app is an example, although I must be very honest, we had to get the help of Google and Apple to do it. Without them, it would have been very difficult. For example, because on an iPhone, you can't run Bluetooth in the background. But on the other hand, why should Apple decide that? Why can't the government say, look, this is a device of everybody, and we think you should be able to do this for this application. So it shows the power, but it also shows that it's possible to do, for example, contact tracing without creating a big database. And this is an example. There is many other things you can do like this.
Yes, that's a very good point, actually. So, but I also, see that the importance of privacy actually depends on the culture, I guess, because, for instance, in Turkey, I mean, when we talk in English, we always use security and privacy together. But in Turkey, we only use the word security because people don't care much about their privacy. So it makes the problem a little bit even harder because not each country or culture pay the same attention to their privacy or their problems, let's say. So thank you very much, Professor Preneel. It was wonderful to have you at our 25th anniversary. And actually, you have been to Turkey many times, and we were hoping to have you here again, but pandemic actually stopped us to have this. But we hope that in the future we can see you here again. And thanks again for accepting our invitation to be here. I hope to come back
someday to METU for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Tezcan, for your contributions. We will continue with our last speaker, Dr. Marina Bossi. But before that, we wanted to share with you some videos from our research groups.